My dear students, welcome back to the lectures of data structures. In this video lecture, we are going to look at the quicksort algorithm. Quicksort algorithm will also follows an approach called divide and conquer. It also follows a strategy called divide and conquer, which we have seen in the previous video lecture, which is merge sort. Both merge sort and quicksort algorithms follows a strategy called divide and conquer, divide and rule method. So here also we are going to divide the list of elements into several sublists, so that after that we will by using the same method we are going to sort the elements. But see here, quicksort is little difficult, and it implements. We are going to implement this quicksort with an element called pivot element. See here, here we are going to identify an element called pivot element from the given list of elements. So after identifying the pivot element, the logic is that whatever the elements that are sorted on the left side of the pivot element, they are smaller than pivot element, and whatever the element that are sorted on the right side of the pivot element, they will be greater than pivot element. See, that is the logic of taking pivot element. So you can consider any element in the list as pivot element. So based on that pivot element, we are going to sort this quicksort. So pivot element will place an important role in quicksort. And we will also consider two things here. From the given list of elements, we will consider one pivot element, and we will consider the next element which is immediately to the pivot element as I, and the last element in the given list of elements as j. So first element here, you can take any element as pivot element, but we are going to consider our first element as pivot element, and the next immediate element to the pivot element will be considered as I, and the last element in the given list of elements will be taken as j. Now we will see step-by-step procedure. Actually, this is the introduction part. Just now what I discussed with you is just the introduction. I will repeat the points. It is following a strategy called divide and conquer, and I will tell you where we are going to use this divide and conquer step. And based on the pivot element, we are going to sort the list of elements using quicksort. And the main logic of selecting pivot element is the elements which are sorted on the left side of the pivot, they will be smaller, and the elements which are sorted on the right side of the pivot, they will be greater than pivot element. So on that basis we are going to look at, we will see the step-by-step procedure for the quicksort. And quicksort, see here one more point, quicksort is an algorithm. It is invented by C.A.R. Hoare. Anyhow, sorting means what I told you in the beginning itself. Sorting is nothing but arranging elements either in ascending or descending order. And we see the step-by-step procedure for this. See the first step here, we will consider our first element. I told you, right, any element can be considered as pivot element, but according to our procedure, though we are following a procedure called selecting a first element as pivot element. And next you take two variables I and j, and you set two variables I and j. The element which is immediately next to the pivot element as I, and the last element as j. So see here the first element and last elements of the list respectively will be considered as I and j. Since we are taking the first element as pivot element, and we will consider the pivot element, we will consider the I value as the element which is next to the pivot element. Okay. So from the given list of elements, the first element will be considered as pivot element. The immediate element of the pivot element will be considered as I. The last element will be considered as j. And our third step here is we will increment I until I value is greater than pivot element. If I value is greater than pivot element, until I value is greater than pivot element. The actual meaning is we will compare I value and pivot element. We will compare I value and pivot element. If I value is smaller than pivot element, we will increment. If I value is greater than pivot element, we will stop incrementing process. I will explain you with an example. Okay. Now we will see the fourth step also. Decrement j until j less than pivot element. meaning is we will compare after that, after comparing I element with pivot element, we'll also compare j element with pivot element. If j element is greater than pivot element, we will decrement. If j element is lesser than pivot element, we will stop decrementing. Try to understand the step here. We will decrement j until I value is less than pivot element, until j value is less than pivot element. We will increment I until I value is greater than pivot element. If I is greater than pivot element, we will stop incrementing. If next, what is the next step? If j value is less than pivot element, we will stop decrementing process. We will see with an example. Don't worry in understanding this. And this is the thing. If I value is lesser than j, after incrementing j or decrementing j, the particular 2-3 steps are over, 4 steps are over. We need to compare I and j values. We will exchange both I and j if I value is lesser than j. If I value is less than j, we will compare, exchange I and j. So, the thing is that we will repeat the steps of 3, 4, 5 until I greater than j. Until I greater than j. So, this is what we have discussed so far. So, we will see the logic of, we will see the example with implementation. Okay. So, these are the given list of elements here. These are the given list of elements for us. All the elements are in unsorted way only. We have the elements 5, 3, 8, 1, 4, 6, 2, 7. According to the process which I told you, we will consider first element as pivot element, next one as I, last one as j. See, in this example here we have considered left and right. You can consider them as I and j, or left and right, no problem, whatever you take. Our first thing is you compare I and pivot element. This left here, right? Here we have written as left. You can consider that as I. Otherwise, you can write as left only, no problem. Compare pivot element and this I element. So I element is smaller than pivot element, right? If it is smaller, what we will do? We will simply increment I value. So I value will be incremented. See here. We have shown that in the here. If I comparing of pivot element and I value is smaller, we will simply increment I value. Now the position of I value has been changed to 8. Again we will compare I value and pivot element. Now I value is greater, right? I value is greater. If I value is greater, what we will do? We will stop incrementing process. So the ith position is now at 8. This is the ith position. Now actually j position is at last. This is the j position. We have not disturbed j position so far. Now we will look after the j position once we stopped incrementing I. See, I has stopped here. Why? Because I value is greater than pivot element now. Now I value is at fixed, and I value, we have stopped I value here only. Now we will not increment. Go for j value. We have compared both I value and pivot element and j value. Since j value is greater than pivot element, we have decremented j. Since j value is greater than pivot element, usually j value must be lesser than this pivot element. If j value is lesser than pivot element, we will not decrement. We will be there at that position. If j value is greater than pivot element, we will decrement the j position. Now the j position has been moved left to the 1 position. After that, now the next step is we need to compare left and right, that is I and j values. If I value is lesser than j, we will leave without we will not swap both the values. See, here you can identify easily. Here the I value is greater than j value, that's why we will swap I and j value. 2 will goes here, 8 will comes here. We are swapping 2 and 8. So 2 goes here, 8 comes here. So this is what we are doing here. We are comparing I and j. After incrementing and decrementing j, we need to compare both I and j. If I value is greater than j, we will simply increment. We will simply swap both the values. Similarly, we have done. And after that, we will see the next step. Okay. Now the I value is at this position, right? Now we'll compare again pivot element and I value. I value is smaller. What we will do, if I value is smaller, we will simply increment I value to next position. Now I value is at 1. Again, if see here, again we will compare I value and pivot element. Still I value is lesser than pivot element. What we will do, we will simply increment. If it is lesser, we will simply increment. That's it. So now the I value position has been changed to 4. Again we will compare I value and pivot element. I value is still smaller than pivot element. Now what we will do, I value position has been changed to 6. So like that continuously you have to change the I value if I value is lesser than pivot element. Now you compare pivot element and I value. Now I value is greater than pivot element. I value is greater than pivot element. What we will do, if I value is greater than pivot element, you stop incrementing and consider I value is at there now at 6. Here I value is at 6. Okay. Now we will leave. We will not increment now if it is greater than pivot element. Now you go to J value. So this is J value, right? J value is at 8 now. J value is at 8. So now what we will do, we will compare J and pivot element. J is greater than pivot element. What we will do if J is greater? If J is greater, we will simply decrement J value. Now both I and J has come to the same position. See. Now both I and J has come to same position at 6. We have decremented J, right? We have decremented J. J comes from 8 to 6th position. So now both I and J are at the same position at 6. Now we'll compare again with J value with pivot element. Still J value is lesser than. Still J value is greater than pivot element. If J value is greater than pivot element, what we will do? We will simply decrement J. Now J value has went to the position of I. Went to the position of 4. Now I value is at 6, J value is at 4. Once the J value has crossed I value, we need to swap J value and pivot element. Please try to follow the logic. Once the J value has swapped, once J value has been crossed I value, we need to swap both J and pivot element. Now pivot element goes here, J value will comes here. So 4 will comes here, P4 comes here, 5 goes there. So like that, what we will do now, once the swapping of pivot element with J is done, we will divide the entire list into 2 parts. So till here it is one list, and this is one list, and this is another list. Okay. What we will do in these 2 sublists, we will consider this as pivot element, this is I, and this is J. Here also this is pivot element, this is I, and last one is J. Okay. So now only one iteration is over. So after the swapping of J and pivot element is done, what we will do is we are comparing the first element as pivot element. The next element of pivot element will be considered as I, and the last element will be considered as J. This is first sublist, right? We have divided the entire list into 2 sublists once the swapping of J and pivot element is done. Now this is another list. We will consider this as pivot element, and next element of pivot is I, J is 7 here. So the process will be implemented separately for this sublist and this sublist separately. So now we will go for the process once again. What we will do, we are considering this as pivot element I and J. This is one sublist. We will see this sublist later. First we will concentrate on this. So what we will do, you see here pivot element I and J. P, I, J. Okay. Now, no, not J is not 2. J is 5. J is 5. Compare both pivot element and I. I is smaller. So if I is smaller, what we will do, we will increment I. Now the position of I has been increased to 2. Again compare this 4 and 2, the pivot element and I. I is smaller than pivot element. That's why please increment I value. I value has been gone to the position of 1. Again compare both pivot element 4 and I value 1. I value is smaller still. What we will do, we will increment I value. Both I value and J value will goes to the same position at 5. Now I value and I and J are at same position. What we will do, we will compare I value and I will compare this I value and pivot element. I value is greater, we will stop incrementing. I value is greater, we will stop incrementing. Now immediately we will go for J value. What we will do, compare J value and pivot element. J value is greater than pivot element. That's why what we will do, we are decrementing J. I value is at 5, J value is at 1 now. Compare J value pivot element once again. After decrementing, we need to compare once again J value and pivot element. Yes, J value is lesser. J value is lesser means what? We will stop decrementing. So what we will do now, once J crossed I, after comparison also, what we will do, we will actually, once J crossed I, we need to swap both pivot element and J. That is our concept. So 1 comes here, 4 goes there. Similarly, we have written the step here, 1 comes here, see here, 1 is here, 1 is here, 4 is here. Okay? So now what we will do here? What we will do? We will divide, again we will divide, see once the J value is swapped, J and pivot element is swapped, we will again divide the list of elements into 2. So this 1, 3, 2 as one sublist and this 4 and 5 as another sublist here. 4 and 5 will go another sublist, 6, 8, 7 is another sublist. As I told you earlier, 6, 8 and 7 is another sublist. We have divided here itself, 6, 8 and 7. So there are 3 lists now. Why? Because in this list also we have divided into 2. Now compare this as pivot element I and J. What we will do, compare I and pivot element. After comparing I and pivot element, I value is greater than pivot element. We will stop incrementing. We will go for J value. Compare J value and pivot element. J value is greater. J value is greater only. We will not. J value is greater means what we will do? We will J value is greater. If J value is greater than pivot element, what we will do? Actually, we need to. If it is smaller, we need to decrement, right? If it is greater, we need to decrement. If it is smaller, we should not decrement actually. And we will compare I and J values here. We will compare I and J values anyhow. I value is lesser than J value. So what we will do here, we will compare I and J values. Both 3 and 2 will be swapped here. So all these 3 elements will comes in the order. 1, 2, 3 will comes in the order. Similarly, we will apply for that same technique for 4, 5 is already in order. No need to apply 6, 8, 7. This one pivot element, this is I and this is J. Now what we will do, pivot element and I. Compare pivot element and I. It is greater. We will stop. Compare pivot element and J. It is also greater. So what we will do now, we will compare I and J values. See, we will compare I and J values. So I value is greater than J. That's why we will swap. 8 comes here, 7 goes there. So after, see, finally we need to sort all the elements in order. That's it. That is the objective of our step. So this is the thing we are going to do finally. Finally, all the elements will be sorted. All the elements will be sorted. This is how we are going to arrange the elements in quick sort. This is what I would like to explain you. And please let me know if you have any doubts in the quick sort. Thank you.